You didn't come here because things are going well. You came here because something happened. Something shifted or broke or was taken. And you've been trying to figure out what to do with that ever since. Maybe it was sudden. Maybe it was slow. Maybe it was a person who left, or a door that closed, or a version of your life that simply stopped being available to you. And here you are, not broken beyond recognition, but not the same either. Somewhere between who you were and who you're still becoming, and the distance between those two things feels longer than it should. Stay with this until the end. Not because I'm going to give you steps, not because I have a formula for your pain, but because something you've been carrying for a long time may finally make sense before we're done. There's a specific kind of grief that doesn't have a name. It's not the grief of death, though sometimes it feels like it. It's the grief of a life that looked different than it does now. The grief of a relationship you thought was permanent. The grief of a career, an identity, a version of yourself that you worked for and then watched dissolve. People don't always know what to do with this kind of grief, because from the outside, you're still here. You're still functioning. You haven't lost everything in the way the world measures loss. But inside, something enormous is missing, and the silence where it used to be is louder than anything anyone around you can hear. You know this silence. You've been living in it. What makes it harder is that it didn't have to happen. That's what no one tells you about betrayal or failure or catastrophic loss. It's not just the thing itself that breaks you. It's the fact that it was preventable. Someone made a choice. A door closed that didn't have to close. A person who should have stayed, left. And you've replayed that moment or those months more times than you can count. Looking for the thing you missed, the sign you ignored, the decision that, if made differently, would have kept your life intact. But here's what that replaying is really costing you. Every time you go back to find where it broke, you are treating your loss as a mistake to be solved. And it isn't. It is something else entirely. There was a man named Job. And before you assume you know this story, let me tell you the part that doesn't make it into most sermons. Job was not a man who suffered because he was weak. He was not a man who made wrong choices and faced consequences. He was, by every measure available to the world he lived in, a man who had done everything right. He had built his life with integrity. He had relationships that meant something. He had resources to influence, identity, family. He had, in the language of his world, been blessed, and then in what feels like a single breath it was gone. Not gradually, not with warning, not with a lesson attached so he could learn something clean and move on. It was taken, all of it, and Job sat in the ash of what his life used to be, and he didn't pretend it was okay. He didn't quote scripture at his own suffering. He sat in it, and he asked the question that every person who has ever lost something real has asked at the bottom of their worst night. Why? Think about the thing that was taken from you, not how it hurt. You already know that. Think about who you were the day before it happened. Think about the identity you carried, the plans that felt certain, the future you had already begun to picture. That person who you were before didn't know what was coming, and the person you are now can never go back to not knowing. That gap between before and after is where most people get stuck, because the version of you that existed before the loss feels like the real you. The one after feels like a lesser version, a reduced version, a version still waiting to be restored to the original. But what if that's the wrong direction to face? When everything was stripped from Job, what remained? Not his wealth, not his children, not his reputation. What remained was Job himself, the essential, irreducible core of a man who had only ever existed underneath all those things. And here is the thing most people miss when they read this story. Job didn't know why it was happening. He wasn't given a memo. He wasn't shown a blueprint. He wasn't told, hold on, this has a purpose, just give it time. He sat in genuine unknowing, and in that unknowing, he was forced into the most uncomfortable truth available to a human being. The only thing you actually are is what remains when everything else is removed. Not what you built, not what you were given, not what people called you. What remains, and for Job, what remained was a man of extraordinary depth. A man the blessing could not fully reveal until the stripping did. This is not easy to hear. I know that, because we are not wired to see loss as revelation. We are wired by survival, by culture, by every message we have ever received to see loss as failure, to see what's been taken as evidence that something is wrong with us, that we weren't enough. that we miss something, that we are, in some fundamental way, behind. And that wiring runs deep. It runs so deep that even when you intellectually understand that suffering can produce something, your nervous system doesn't believe it. Your nervous system is still in the ash, still cataloging what's missing, still measuring the distance between what was and what is. And the gap feels like evidence of damage, when it is actually evidence of excavation. Excavation. Think about what that word means. When you excavate, you remove what's on top, not to destroy the ground beneath, to reveal what was always there, to access what the surface was covering. Everything built on top of Job, his wealth, his status, his visible life was covering something, not hiding something shameful, covering something that needed space, depth, room to become what it was always meant to be, and the only way to get to it was through the taking. You've been measuring your life from the wrong starting point. You've been measuring from the peak of what you had, looking at now as a descent. But what if the ground level of your life is not where you think it is? What if you are not below where you started? What if you are being taken down to something solid? What if beneath everything that was removed, there is a foundation being poured, one you could not build on before, because you were too busy managing what was already constructed above it? Here is something that psychology has quietly confirmed, that ancient wisdom has always known. The people who experience the deepest, most lasting transformation in identity are almost never the people who had it easy. They are the people who were forced inward, who had the external scaffolding of their identity removed and had to find out what was underneath. Because here is the truth about survival mode. When you are in survival mode, you are not broken. You are conserving. You are redirecting every resource you have toward the single task of remaining. And remaining when the world around you is dissolving is not a small thing. It is, quietly, one of the most remarkable things a human being can do. You are still here. In the middle of everything that tried to define you as finished, you are still here. That is not nothing. That is the foundation speaking. What did that season demand of you that you never would have chosen to develop on your own? Sit with that, not as a silver lining, not as a spiritual consolation prize, as a genuine question. What did you have to become in the middle of the losing that you could not have become any other way? What capacity was forced open in you that comfort would have kept closed? Because this is where Job's story turns. Not in the restoration, in the becoming. The restoration only makes sense because of who Job became in the ash. The man who received everything back was not the same man who lost everything. He was deeper. He was more present. He was less dependent on the visible. He had learned, not as theology, but as lived truth, what he was made of when everything else was gone. And that knowledge does not go away. That knowledge becomes the ground. There is a particular kind of person who finds themselves here. Not everyone arrives at this place. Most people, when life gets difficult, find a way around it. They distract. They perform. They rebuild the surface quickly so no one, including themselves, has to look too long at what's underneath. But you didn't do that. Maybe you tried to. Maybe for a while the distraction worked. But eventually, in the quiet, in the middle of the night, in the moment between one thought and the next, it found you again. The loss, the unanswered question of it, the strange, heavy feeling that something is not finished, that you are not finished, and the fact that you are still sitting with it, still willing to feel it, still asking what it means, tells me something about you that I want you to hear. You are not someone who takes the easy exit. You never were, and that is not a coincidence. Let me tell you something about the way identity is formed, not the way we like to believe it's formed through success, through achievement, through the accumulation of good things. The way it actually forms, identity, the real kind, the kind that holds, is almost always forged in resistance, in the place where something pushed back against you, in the season where the life you expected became the life you had to survive. Psychologists have a term for what happens to a person's sense of self after significant loss. They call it identity disruption, and it sounds clinical, cold, like something to be treated and resolved. But what it actually describes is this: the moment when the story you were telling about yourself, the one built on your role, your relationships, your accomplishments, your future, stops being available, and you are left, sometimes for the first time in your adult life, with a question you don't know how to answer. Who am I, if not this? That question is terrifying. I want to name that clearly, because most personal development content will rush past it. will hand you an affirmation or a framework before you've had a chance to actually feel the weight of it. Who am I if not this? If not this relationship? If not this career? If not this version of my future? If not the person everyone expected me to be? If not the life I built? Who am I? And here is what I need you to understand about that question. It is not a sign of weakness that you don't immediately know the answer. It is a sign that the question is real. The people who answer it too quickly, who snap back into a new identity before the old one has fully released, are the ones who carry the unprocessed weight of it for decades, who rebuild the same patterns with different names, who mistake motion for transformation. You are not doing that. You are sitting in the question. And the question, as uncomfortable as it is doing something necessary. It is clearing the ground. This is where Joseph enters the story. And I want you to pay attention not to the outcome, not to the palace at the end, but to the process. Because the process is where you are. Joseph was 17 years old when his brothers threw him into a pit. Not a metaphorical pit, a physical one. He had done nothing to deserve it. He was, by most accounts, a young man of genuine gifts, someone who had been given something real, something that set him apart, and his brothers, the people who should have been his protection, his community, his belonging, looked at what he carried and decided it was a threat. So, they took it. They took his coat. They took his freedom. They took his place in the family. They sold him. And then they went home and told his father he was dead. I need you to feel what that moment contains. Not just the betrayal of it, though. That is enormous. But the specific kind of devastation that comes from being diminished by the people who were supposed to celebrate you, because that is a particular wound. When a stranger rejects you, it hurts, but you can contextualize it. When the people who know you, who have watched you grow, who have eaten at the same table, who should understand your value better than anyone, look at what you carry and decide to destroy it instead. That wound goes deeper than most people can articulate. It doesn't just hurt. It makes you question whether what you carried was ever real, whether the gifts were real, whether the calling was real, whether you somehow misread the whole thing, whether you deserved what happened to you. You've felt this before, maybe not in the same form, but you know the specific confusion of being underestimated or betrayed by someone who should have known better, and you know how that confusion left unnamed begins to turn inward. Joseph did not arrive in Egypt as a confident young man secure in his destiny. He arrived as property, stripped of everything that had defined him. His family name gone, his coat gone, his future, as he had imagined it, gone. He was, in the most literal sense, a person who had lost everything that gave his life shape and meaning. And he was surrounded by people who did not know who he had been, who only knew what he appeared to be now, a slave. And here is what the story does not rush past, even though we often do. Joseph kept going, not triumphantly, not with a motivational speech. He simply kept going. In Potiphar's house, he worked with integrity, not because he had been rewarded for it, not because circumstances had proven that integrity leads somewhere good. He had evidence, in fact, of the opposite. He worked with integrity because it was the only version of himself he knew how to be, and that quiet, stubborn faithfulness to who he was, even when who he was, had cost him everything. That is where the restoration begins. Not at the palace. There, in Potiphar's house, in the smallest expression of continued identity, when every external reason to maintain it had been removed. This is not something they tell you about restoration. They tell you it comes from the outside, from the circumstances shifting, from the door finally opening, from the person who wronged you finally being exposed. But that is not where restoration begins. Restoration begins in the interior. In the moment when you choose consciously or quietly, dramatically or with exhaustion, to remain yourself. Even here, even now, even in this version of your life that looks nothing like what you planned. Even in the silence where your old identity used to be, you keep being you, not the performance of you, not the curated version, not the one that needs external validation to feel real. The actual you, the one that existed before the loss, the one that exists in the middle of it, the one that will still be there deeper, clearer, more certain on the other side. If someone had told you then what you know now, would you have believed them? Think about that honestly. In the middle of your worst season, if someone had sat beside you and said, "This is not your ending, this is your excavation," would you have believed them? Probably not. And And that's important, because it means that what you're being asked to hold right now is not certainty. It is not a clear vision of what comes next. It is something smaller and harder and more honest than that. It is the willingness to remain open, to not close the story before it is finished, to not decide in this chapter, in this season, in this version of your life that feels diminished, that this is all there is. Because here is what Joseph's story reveals about the architecture of restoration. Every single thing that was taken from him became something he needed. Not symbolically, not poetically, structurally. The pit, the most violent expression of rejection he experienced, became the beginning of a journey that led somewhere his father's house never could have. The time in Potiphar's house service he never asked for, in a country he never chose, built in him an understanding of how power and administration actually work. The prison, the second unjust confinement. The second time he was punished for doing the right thing, put him in proximity to the exact people he would need to know. The delay, the years, the cupbearer forgot him. The years he sat in a cell when he should have already been released stretched something in him, some capacity for patience that impatience would have made impossible, some depth of character that comfort would have made unnecessary. Every layer of what was taken from Joseph was, in retrospect, a layer of what was being built, not instead of his destiny, as the pathway to it. And I need you to hear this carefully, because it is easy to take a story like Joseph's and make it sound like suffering has a silver lining, like if you just believe hard enough, everything will turn out fine. That is not what I am saying. What I am saying is something harder and more specific. I am saying that what was taken from you has not been wasted, that the capacity you have built in the surviving, the depth you have found in the questioning, the strength you have discovered in the remaining, that is not a consolation prize. That is material, real, structural, irreducible material. That the version of you being built in this season is not a lesser version waiting to return to the original. It is the version that can actually hold what is coming. Because here is the thing about Job's restoration that most people read too quickly. At the end of the story, Job receives back more than he lost. And the easy reading of that is, God gave him a reward for his suffering. But that reading misses the most important detail. Job could not have received what he received at the end if he had been the same person he was at the beginning. The blessing at the end of Job's story required a man of different capacity, a man who had been through something, a man whose identity was no longer dependent on the blessing to feel like himself, a man who had sat in the ash and discovered what he was made of when everything was gone. That man could hold what came next. The man before the suffering, as good as he was, could not. Not because he was less worthy, but because he hadn't yet become large enough to carry it. And this is what I want you to sit with now, not as a theological concept, as a living question about your own life. What is being built in you right now that you haven't been able to name yet? What capacity is being stretched in you in the waiting, in the rebuilding, in the strange in-between of this season that you are going to need, not someday, as a vague comfort, but specifically, practically, what are you becoming right now, in the middle of this that you could not have become any other way? Because the answer to that question is not behind you. It is not in the life that was taken. It is here, being formed, being prepared, being poured like a foundation beneath everything that is still to come. There is a mode that activates inside a person when life becomes unsafe. Not unsafe in the dramatic sense, unsafe in the quiet sense. When the future you trusted stops being available, when the ground you were standing on shifts beneath you, when the people or the plans or the version of yourself that made life feel navigable disappear, something inside you shifts. And it shifts without asking your permission. Your nervous system, ancient, intelligent, designed for your survival, makes a decision. It pulls resources inward. It narrows focus. It says, we are not expanding right now. We are conserving. We are not dreaming right now. We are enduring. We are not becoming right now. We are surviving. And for a season, that is exactly right. That is not weakness. That is wisdom. The kind of wisdom that lives in the body before the mind catches up. But here is what no one tells you about survival mode. It is not designed to be permanent. It is designed to be temporary. A bridge, a holding pattern, a biological grace period that says, you don't have to be fully alive right now. Just remain. Just endure. Just get through this particular night. But the problem, the real, quiet, devastating problem is that survival mode doesn't turn itself off. It waits for a signal that it's safe to open again. And if that signal never comes clearly, if the loss was deep enough, if the betrayal was real enough, if the failure was public enough, the nervous system stays in the narrow place, long after the immediate danger has passed, long after the worst of it is over, and you find yourself months later, years later, still living in the contracted version of yourself, still unable to want things the way you used to, still unable to trust the future the way you once did, still waiting without quite knowing what you're waiting for to feel like yourself again. And this right here is where the most subtle damage of loss lives. Not in the acute pain, not in the first weeks when everything is raw and undeniable, but in the slow erosion of aliveness that happens when survival mode becomes a permanent address, when the contraction that was meant to protect you begins to define you, when you start to mistake the narrowed version of yourself for the real one, when you begin to believe, not consciously, not in words you would say out loud, that the expansive version of you was the anomaly, and this contracted, careful, guarded life is what's real. I want to name something that might be uncomfortable to hear. Some part of you has been waiting to feel like yourself again before you start living like yourself again, waiting to feel healed before you act healed, waiting to feel certain before you move with certainty, waiting for some internal signal, some shift in the feeling that tells you it's safe to want things again, safe to believe again, safe to become again. And that waiting, however understandable, however human, is keeping you in the ash, not because your feelings aren't valid. They are. Not because the pain wasn't real. It was. But because the signal you're waiting for, the feeling that tells you it's safe, is not going to arrive before you move. It arrives because you move. This is what Job discovered in the ash. Not a feeling of readiness. Not a moment where the grief lifted cleanly and was replaced by hope. He discovered something harder than that. He discovered that the only way through was through. That the question he kept asking times why times was not going to be answered in the way he needed it to be answered. That the silence of the waiting was not absence, it was formation. And at some point, not dramatically, not with a lightning bolt, something in Job shifted, not from grief to joy, from contraction to openness, from the closed fist of survival to the open hand of trust. And that shift, that interior turn, happened before the restoration arrived, not after. Before, the restoration did not create the shift. The shift created the conditions for the restoration. And I need you to feel the weight of that distinction, because we have been trained by every story we have ever consumed to believe that the external change comes first, that the door opens and then we feel hope, that the relationship heals and then we feel safe, that the career rebounds and then we feel like ourselves again. But Job's story inverts that completely. The interior shift came first. The openness came first. The willingness to receive the capacity to hold something new came first. And then, only then, could what was lost be restored, not returned. Restored. There is a difference. Return means going back to what was. Restoration means being given something new that is built on the foundation of what you survived. You are not going back. You were never going back. The version of your life you lost, that specific configuration, is not the destination. It was the beginning, and what is coming, what is being built beneath you right now, is not a replica of what was taken. It is something that could only exist because of what you went through. Something that carries the depth of your surviving, the texture of your endurance, the capacity that was opened in you by the very thing that tried to close you down. Joseph stood before Pharaoh, not as the boy who was thrown into a pit, not as the slave who was falsely accused, not as the prisoner who was forgotten. He stood as someone who had been through every one of those things and had remained himself, his integrity, his identity, his connection to something larger than his circumstances through every single one. And when Pharaoh looked at him, what he saw was not a lucky man. What he saw was a prepared one, a man who carried in his body the education of the pit, the patience of the prison, the endurance of the delay, a man who could be trusted with something enormous because he had already proven, in the smallest and most invisible moments, that he could be trusted, not to the people watching, to himself. And here is what that means for you. Every moment you have remained in the confusion, in the grief, in the survival mode, in the quiet of a life that looked smaller than it was supposed to be. Every moment you chose integrity when bitterness was easier. Every moment you kept going when stopping made more sense. Every moment you remained open when closing was safer. That was not wasted time. That was preparation time, not labeled, not celebrated, not visible to anyone watching from the outside, but structural, real, being deposited into you like layers of foundation beneath everything that is still to come. You've been here before, not in this exact season, but in the feeling of it, the feeling of being in the middle of something that doesn't have a clear ending yet, the feeling of carrying something you can't fully name, the feeling of being further along inside than the outside of your life currently reflects, and you survived every version of that feeling that came before this one, not perfectly, not without cost, but you survived it, and something in you, the deepest, most irreducible part of you already knows that you will survive this one too, not survive it in the sense of just getting through, survive it in the sense of being transformed by it, enlarged by it, made into someone that this season, as hard as it has been, was always in the process of creating. I want to tell you something about the end of Job's story, not the part about the restoration of his wealth, not the numbers, the doubled livestock, the new children, the returned prosperity, the part that most people read past, after everything, after the ash, after the silence, after the friends who said the wrong things, after the questions that never got clean answers. Job prayed for his friends, the ones who had misunderstood him, the ones who had, in his worst season, added to his suffering with their theology instead of sitting with him in his humanity. He prayed for them, and the text says it was after he prayed for them that his own restoration came, not before. After. Think about what that requires, to have been through what Job had been through, to have lost what he lost, to have been surrounded by people who failed him in his suffering, and to open his hands wide enough to become spacious enough to pray for them. That is not a small thing. That is a man who has been so thoroughly transformed by what he survived that he is no longer living from the wound. He is living from something deeper, something that doesn't need the people who failed him to be punished before he can be free, something that can release not because the pain wasn't real, but because he has become too large for the pain to be the whole story. That largeness, that is what is being built in you, not in spite of the loss, through it, because of it, in the specific way that only this season with its particular weight, its particular silence, its particular cost could produce. And now, I want you to do something, not for me, not for an algorithm, not as a performance of healing. I want you to do this for yourself. I want you to think honestly, quietly, without editing about what remains, not what was taken, what remains, after the loss, after the betrayal, after the failure, after the season that stripped everything that wasn't essential. What is still here? Who is still here? What in you has proven itself unremovable? What have you discovered about yourself in the surviving that you could not have discovered any other way? Because what remains, that is your foundation, not what you're trying to rebuild on top of, not what you're hoping to recover. What is already here, already solid, already proven, the ground that the loss for all its violence could not touch. This is not your ending. You already know that. You've known it quietly, stubbornly, against every piece of evidence that tried to convince you otherwise for longer than you've admitted. Something in you has refused to close the story. Something in you has kept the question open, has kept moving even slowly, even imperfectly, even in the contracted version of yourself that survival mode produced. That refusal, that stubborn, inarticulate, sometimes exhausted refusal to be finished, that is not denial. That is the sound of a foundation holding, beneath the weight of everything you've been carrying, holding what is being built in you right now that you haven't been able to name yet. You don't have to name it. You just have to stop treating your life like it's evidence against you. Stop reading this season as proof of your diminishment. Start reading it, even tentatively, even with one hand still on the wound, as preparation, as excavation, as the specific, necessary, irreplaceable process of becoming someone who can hold what is coming, because it is coming, not as a reward, not as compensation, as the natural result of a foundation being prepared, as the inevitable next chapter of a story that has never not once been about your destruction. It has always been about your formation, and you are not at the beginning of that formation. You are deep into it, deeper than you know, closer than it feels, more prepared than the outside of your life currently reflects. And so, not as a shout, not as performance, not as something you say for anyone else, but as the truest thing you know about where you are, as a declaration of what is already happening beneath the surface of this season, as the name of what you are becoming. Say it, feel it, let it land in the deepest part of you that has been waiting for permission to believe it. I am being restored, not will be, not hoping to be, not someday, maybe, if everything works out. I am being restored, right now, in this season, in this version of your life that looks incomplete from the outside, in the middle of the question, in the middle of the rebuilding, in the middle of becoming someone the next chapter actually requires. I am being restored. And when this video ends, when you close this and go back to the life that is still in process, carry that with you, not as a feeling. Feelings will shift. As a structural truth, the way a foundation carries a building, not because you can always see it, but because everything stands on it. Job got up from the ash, not because the pain was gone, because he had become someone larger than the pain. Joseph walked out of the prison, not because the injustice was erased, because he had been prepared in the very place that tried to define him as forgotten for the exact moment that was waiting for him. And you are going to walk out of this season, not as the person who entered it, as the person it was always making you into, deeper, clearer, more certain of what you're made of, more able to hold what is coming, more ready than you feel, more restored than you know. This is not the end of your story. It is the foundation of it.